Welcome to Module 5. I'm Rana Gupta. You may recall in the last Module 4, I mentioned the word comparables. Now we know the word compare as an adjective, as in comparing one person to another. But in a financial context, in this case, it's a noun actually. A comparable is a company. It's a company that's sufficiently similar to yours such that you can compare what you're doing with what they have done or they are doing, and you can learn from their experiences. So if these modules are about writing a good financial plan and an approach to writing that plan, why are we pursuing comparables? The reason is that comparables immediately allow you and your investors to put your company in perspective with relation to the market. Let's use the real estate market as an example. So the real estate market is probably the most mature, comparables-driven market in the world. You know the old adage, never buy the most expensive house on the block, okay? That is a comparables-driven statement. Because we look at a house that we're either looking to buy or sell, and we look at the aspects, the facets of that house. We look at how many bathrooms are there, how many bedrooms, proximity to local transportation in order to value that house. So take that analogy and apply it now to your company and look at milestones. Which milestones have you achieved and will you achieve? So just as with a house, we value a house based on those facets, investors are going to be valuing your company based on the milestones that you have and plan to achieve. In this module, we'll learn about comparables, we'll put together a checklist of sorts for those modules, and learn how to extract as much information from them as we can, while we're also incorporating the concepts from the previous modules into this analysis. Let's be clear here. I'm not suggesting for 1 second that what you're working on isn't innovative, creative, and novel. What I am suggesting, however, is that you can learn from others' mistakes and successes. You don't have to spin your wheels or recreate the wheel. There's so much to be learned from what other companies have done and are doing that you can incorporate into your plan. One of the most common mistakes that we CEOs make is thinking that our company is completely unique. It often manifests itself, believe it or not, in CEOs saying, I don't really have any competition. Whatever you do, don't make that mistake. There's always competition out there. But my point is this, maybe your technology is indeed brand new, but I'll tell you what, your product, the market you're going after, the nature of the clinical data that you're going to have to gather, that's probably not so new and others have had to do something similar. Or conversely, you're using an existing technology, but you've created a new twist on it. You have a new business model. Similarly, the market you're going after and the processes you're going to have to pursue, you're most likely going to have in similar fashion from other companies. Because what comparables do is they find those similarities for you. You'll identify what other people have done and what are their successes. You'll want to imitate those. What are their failures? You'll want to avoid those. By doing comparables analysis, you also prove to investors that you're serious. You're serious about your company and that you're setting yourself up to succeed, and you don't want to pursue the same pitfalls, and you want to identify the success factors. Because the fact is, comparables analysis is a lot of work, but you'll be rewarded by understanding those success factors. The very first thing you're going to want to do is to go talk to people. So, customers, vendors, investors, colleagues, potential advisors, competition. Go out and start talking, listening, identifying comparable companies. Go online and find similar companies and products. Start to create a list for yourself. It'll be a dynamic list. So this list, you can see, is put together by actually investment bankers. In this particular case, these investment bankers were evaluating their client's company, a diagnostic company. Probably they were either helping that client sell the company or sell shares in the company, very similar. Either way, they had to value the company, so they put together a comparables list. They collected financial data so that they could quantitatively determine what's the value of the company. But take note just how many companies they gathered in their comparables list. we're going to create a checklist of sorts. It'll be an easy way to track what's similar between your company and other comparable companies. And we'll look at success factors so that you can measure them. Let's start with, if I wanted to compare myself with another person, what would be the obvious first place I would look? It'd be appearance. So I might pick two people I look like very similar, such as Rosie Greer and Donald Sutherland. All right, very good. Second attribute, profession. Well, then my comparison falls apart. I may look like them, but we certainly have very different professions. After that, I'm probably going to look at more subtle facets to compare myself with them, such as where did they grow up and their background, what's their education, what are their values. Similarly, there are the obvious variables with which you'll compare yourself to another company, but then there are more subtle ones. And that's what we're going to describe in this module, and I'll help you put together that more subtle part of the checklist. Let me say a word about talking to competitors. So clearly we're all very leery about talking to competitors, and as a young company, as a young venture, we're even more leery because we're afraid that they may steal something from us. By the way, keep in mind, they're probably a little leery of you too, because you're their worst nightmare. They know about their existing large company competitors, but a young, new company and a brand new technology is one of the things they fear most. So, when you go talk to them, obviously they're going to be careful and you're going to be careful, but don't put your head in the sand. Go talk to your competitors. You're going to learn so much, I guarantee you. I'll tell you a story from my favorite competitor, head in the sand analysis. My last company, the cancer diagnostics one, there was this one competitor. We were so scared of them. They were almost like he who shall not be named. We just didn't know what to do. We were deer in the headlights, stuck. So one day, while I was sitting at my desk worrying about them, I realized I tell my students all the time, call your competitors, call your competitors. So I picked up the phone and I called the CEO of that other company. Sure enough, he called me back in 30 minutes and he said, I'm so glad you called and left that message. We can't do what you can do. Sure enough, we struck a deal together. I didn't know that. We were so scared of them. But that call emboldened me then to call all of my competitors, which I did, and I met with them, and I learned so much. So make sure you call them up and have that meeting. In addition to these third-party interviews, go out and talk to other companies. Now, we've talked about competitors here, but I'm talking about other companies that are just comparables. Now, the other thing to do is talk with team members of companies that haven't even succeeded. Find out why they didn't succeed. Ask them about the assumptions that they made or failed to make. Learn about the reasons of the milestones they didn't achieve or set out to achieve. Let me give you a hint. All investors, I don't care if it's the government or a bank or an angel investor, as soon as you walk in the door, they're going to compare you with another company they've met, heard about, or read about. So the extent to which you can beat them to it and lead that conversation, you will distinguish yourself. What are some of the obvious variables for you to consider? So immediately you're going to want to look at what type of company your comparable companies are. Are they a medical device company? Are they a therapeutics company? Diagnostics? Life sciences? Okay. Perhaps you'll look at what indication they're going after. You'll look at the nature of their product, the nature of the pricing of their product, the market they're going after. You may look at their packaging or their user interface. These are the obvious variables. Let's talk about the more subtle ones. That's the part that often eludes people doing comparables analysis for the first time. The first on our checklist is type of financing. Now, we all assume, because it's so prevalent, that most likely at some point in our path we'll take in either venture capital or angel money, but equity money in some way. Well, the fact is, by looking at comparables analysis, you may find that equity is not what your company that maybe you've emulated, it's not how they funded themselves. You may find they took in corporate money, that they worked with a corporation to bring themselves forward. You may find, for example, that a technology or a product that you really find is a perfect comparable was never a young company, it was grown up within a corporation entirely. Or you may find that another venture had the government as its benefactor. Did you know, for example, that the Veterans Administration and the Army are two of the biggest benefactors for research in cancer? So the fact is, by looking at comparables, you may determine that venture capital and angel or equity financing is actually not in your path, and you may find a better fit for your company with a form of financing. This goes back to Module 4, and identifying the right form of financing for your company. As a VC, there was this one technology I was very enamored of, and I spent almost 2 years actually doing research on that company with the researcher, trying to figure out how are we going to bring this to market. Well, I will admit to you, a little too late in my efforts, I undertook the comparables analysis. Once we did, he and I, we found that the technologies and the products that really we were emulating were not venture-backed. So venture capital, it turns out, was not the right financing vehicle for that other technology, because those other comparables actually had a slow adoption rate that was too slow for a venture capital firm, but it was perfect for a large corporation. They have a longer time frame. So that sent him in a different direction, looking for a different form of financing. And this is where comparables helped him understand what's the best fit. In Module 2, I suggested very strongly that you have to state your objective. What's your objective in starting this company? And you have to match your objective with the right form of financing so that you have a good match. Okay? I've also mentioned that many researchers have said to me what they really want to do and what their objective is to get this technology out there. It's a perfectly fine objective. However, I'm also going to tell you many of those researchers found themselves taking equity financing, venture capital financing. But then, when their company was shut down, then they were disappointed. But why was it shut down? Let's remember. Venture capitalists, let's say they make 10 investments. Over 5 of those investments will be shut down. They're very risky, and by design, a VC will shut down over 50% of his or her portfolio. So the fact that those companies were shut down was by design. It was a bad fit between what the professor or the researcher wanted and his or her objective and the form of financing. It's not the VC's fault. They were just doing their job. Next on the checklist, timing for financing. Look at, in your comparable companies, when did they take in, let's just start with the first investment. For that first investment, what milestones had your comparable companies already achieved? What risk had they reduced? What milestones had they achieved? For example, had they invested a substantial amount of sweat equity? Remember sweat equity? Sweat equity is when you invest your own time and money and resources. It's nothing that shows up formally on any documentation, but lots of teams will say, you know, let's reach these milestones before we take in our first money. Whatever that is, whether it's grant money or angel money or what have you. But understanding when your comparable companies took in that money and what they had achieved first is a very important lesson to learn from your comparables analysis. Next on the checklist, maturity of the technology. Now this is addressing that last item on the checklist, but slightly differently. So let's look now out further in terms of the different stages of financing. So most young companies are going to need some financing and then more, whatever type it is, once again. But now look at the stages of the technology, from technology to engineering to product. Look at the milestones that your comparable companies achieved at different stages of when they took in money so that you can understand what was important to those financiers with respect to risk and reward and development, because remember, for all investors, when they invest, is the time and the money relationship is very important. You remember in the last module I mentioned a company that we had funded too early as a venture capitalist, and we couldn't find a follow-on investor. So keep in mind how the maturity of your company and technology with respect to different forms of financing, and learn from your comparable companies. Let's stop for a minute. What are we doing here? What's the point of the comparables? They're to help you optimize the value of your company. We've looked at investment bankers that will look at comparables to value their client's company. We've looked at the real estate market and looking at the facets of a house to figure out how much it's worth. So similarly, think about the origin of your technology as being akin to the location of a house. Therefore, what are we doing here? We're building a story, we're validating a story, and we're looking at the assumptions behind that validation in the story. Using the real estate in this example, does a third bathroom increase the value of a house or does it take away from living space? Applying that to your company, are the milestones you're considering, are all of them adding value, or are any of them just a distraction? Next on the checklist, origin of the technology. So, did the technology in your comparable companies, did it come from a laboratory? Did it come from a university? Or did it come from an independent inventor? And this gets to the credibility of the underlying technology. Let's face it, it's human bias to place value on a technology that perhaps came from an august research institution with world-renowned researchers versus something from a lesser school or an independent inventor. So look at those comparables. Let's say you're looking at a comparable company and sure enough, it was spun out of a lesser-known institution in some form, laboratory or school. Find out if they had trouble financing it. What kind of trouble did they have and what did they do to overcome it? If that other company, comparable company or technology came from an independent inventor, what did that person do? What did those founders do? Did they hire, really good advisors from industry? Did they find themselves a world-class CEO? How did your comparable companies overcome any sort of issues of the origin of the technology? Next on the checklist, amount of money raised. So when I was in venture capital, we used to joke amongst ourselves, it doesn't matter how capital efficient a venture thinks they are, everything's going to take at least $20 million. And we were mostly making fun of ourselves as much as the CEOs that everything takes twice as long and costs twice as much. So in your comparables analysis, you may be shocked to learn just how much money your comparable companies had to raise to achieve their significant milestones and get to a sustainable level. Likewise, you may be shocked to learn that many of the companies that didn't succeed didn't raise enough money. They were poorly funded, and in a sense, referring to Module 1, they ran out of gas in between exits. Next on the checklist, partnerships and collaborations. It's nearly impossible to grow your venture without the help of some sort of large corporation to help you along your way. It could be their distribution, it could be their expertise, it could be their assets, some form of a large corporation, because it's very difficult and very expensive to go it alone in this day and age. So now, looking at the word partnership, collaboration, I use them interchangeably, just so we're clear, in case you think there's a distinction. Some people make a distinction. What's important here in this analysis are the terms that you negotiate with that large corporation to advance your company, advance your plan, and your milestones. When looking at partnerships and collaborations with your comparable companies, ask yourself 3 questions. Why, when, and what when you sit down with them? Why? Why did they strike the deal at that time? Maybe at the time it was a bold move for them. In retrospect, it may look obvious, but find out why they did it. Maybe they had found some impediment to moving forward, and that's why they did it. When? When did they do it in their evolution of milestones? So for example, you may find out by talking to that comparable company that they wish they had achieved some more milestones than they had when they struck that deal because their negotiating power would have been stronger. What? Following on, what were the deal terms that they struck? And what were those terms, for example, with a customer versus a vendor? Different deal terms? Because as I mentioned in the last module, when you're dealing with a corporation, sky's the limit. Your creativity is the limit. There's no standard way to engage in a deal with them. So learn from those comparable companies what were the nature of the terms that they struck. Now this item in the checklist is rich with information. You'll learn a heck of a lot about terms and assumptions and milestones and the deals that they struck. This goes right back to Module 3 where we talked about processes. Remember those? So if we say, to pick an example, a marketing process, you may strike a deal with a corporation to advance that process. Think about that deal as a tool to advance the process of marketing to reach a milestone. So you might strike a different deal with a different corporation in your sales process. Another one yet in your operations. Next item on the checklist, team talent. I delicately referred to this above when we talked about the origin of a technology. And I'm referring candidly to the pedigree, in this case, of the founders. So where did the founders come from? Did they come again from an august institution? It's human nature to value founders that have come from, say, august institutions. Now, you'll often hear investors say things like, I'm betting on the jockey and not the horse. That's the way of an investor saying they're investing in the team, perhaps more than the technology. Now, a cynic may look at that and say, I knew it. It's all a matter of where you come from. But in fact, a realist should say, I'm going to put together the best possible team I can. So look at comparable companies and understand, where did the founders come from? How did they overcome any hurdles? So at the end of the day, your job is to put together the best possible team that will be the most valued by both your customers and your investors. In summary, comparables are by far one of the most important aspects of your financial plan. You learn so much quantitative and qualitative from them. What are we doing with assumptions? We're optimizing the value of your venture. You're looking at the milestones they've achieved. You're looking at the assumptions that they made in order to quantify how you're going to optimize your plan. Let me tell you a story about the last company that I've mentioned a couple of times, the cancer diagnostics company. So when I took over that company as CEO, the company was already 2 years old, already in business, platform, life science company. I sat down as CEO and I said, all right, how am I going to optimize the value of this company? So going back to basics, I spent the next several months talking to venture capitalists and investment bankers. That company, by the way, was venture-backed, so it was appropriate to talk to VCs. I spent a few months listening and listening and listening in order to figure out, how do I take this thing to optimize its value? What I learned, although simple, was not easy. I had to transform the company from a platform life science company into a product-driven diagnostics company. It was obvious in hindsight, not easy to do, but that's what we had to do over the next 4 years. And I learned that from going out and looking at comparables. It would be inadvisable and probably impossible for us to cover all the components of a financial plan in these short modules. But let's go over what we have learned. If you remember, in Module 3, I said there's an assumption and a prerequisite that before you engage in this financial planning, you've already engaged in customer discovery. From your customer discovery, you will have learned what's the market need, who's your customer, what's the value proposition, and what's your business model. From these modules, you'll have learned the following. What are the milestones you have to achieve? What's the amount of money that you have to raise? What's the type of financing that you should raise? What's the use of those funds? What are your revenue projections? What are your cost projections? How are you going to make money? Very important. You can calculate break even, and now you can look at your market size. The objective statement for these modules, if you recall, was how do you set yourself up to succeed? And the thesis statement to help you do that is, how do we make the assumptions to build a plan to navigate the constraints so that you'll achieve your milestones? We also talked about, in order to help set yourself up to succeed, that you have to incorporate your personal needs into your plan. You have to incorporate your personal objectives into your plan. You may not separate your personal needs from this venture. You may not divorce the realities of the two. Another thing you may not divorce. You have been trained rigorously in the scientific method, hypotheses and assumptions. Too often, researchers will take that training and simply abandon it when it comes to their venture and all of a sudden take on the role of salesman. Don't do that. Keep your role as a rigorous researcher and apply those skills to the building of your venture and your financial plan. These modules were funded by the government. The government wants to give out the grants to researchers to advance your technologies from a research institution to commercialization, to helping patients in the healthcare system. But what the government also wants is to make sure that you accept these grants in the context of a larger financial plan. What does that mean? That means that your financial plan takes this grant and puts it in context, the context of achieving certain milestones, reducing risk, but also, very importantly, securing the next financing. What the government doesn't want you to do is take this grant money, burn through it, and then wonder what happens next. Most young companies run out of cash. Most CEOs of young companies complain about investors. And while there's certainly a lot to complain about, that's actually misplaced blame. It is our job as the CEO to write a plan that manages the risk and reward for our investors. It's our job to write a plan that manages their cash wisely. It's our job to write a plan that reaches the milestones we said we were going to achieve. And it's our burden to remember that we're spending their money. And it's incumbent upon us to communicate to them that we know that. One of the most important words that I've highlighted in these modules is risk. Always keep your eye on risk. Now, I'm not doubting for a second that you're onto something big, that you have created a technology perhaps that will save lives, that will transform the healthcare system. I'm not doubting that you're looking at a game changer, and you're probably saying, well, that's exactly right, and this is a huge opportunity. But let's stop for a minute and look at that word opportunity. The word opportunity is open-ended, isn't it? But we're talking here about an investment. What's the difference? An opportunity is open-ended, an investment is bounded. It's bounded by risk and reward. And let me ask you this, what changes or transforms an opportunity into an investment? Assumptions. Assumptions are the difference between an opportunity and an investment, and we also know that the assumptions that you make are the building blocks to a well-built, milestone-driven plan. So what you don't want to do is walk into an investor's office and say, this is a great opportunity. What you do want to do is walk in and say, I have an excellent investment for you. Okay, well, that's it for me. I wish you good luck and good fortune.